Hello, everybody. I think we are getting ready to go to our next session. This will be a fireside chat. Maybe she's born with it, maybe she worked for it. I'll be talking with Noemi Garcia. I'll do a quick intro and then we'll jump right in. Sorry, got to bring up the bio. So Noemi is the leader of Catastrophe Modeling and Modernization at Nationwide Insurance. She has more than 10 years of experience in the team that supports risk management strategies and profitable growth for Nationwide's property portfolio. Noemi's natural curiosity, passion for innovative strategies, and commitment to serving people have made her a successful leader. Noemi is also president of the National Latino Alliance Associate Resource Group at Nationwide and is passionate about serving the Latino Hispanic community. Noemi was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, and in her spare time, she likes to read and write, dabbling in short stories and poetry. So Noemi, thank you so much for being here today. I am so excited to get started.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm excited to be here too. That's quite a bio. I'm like, wow.
Absolutely. That was my impression too. It's like, wow, she's amazing.
Yeah, it's a long time. That's all it is. It's all time. So.
All right. So let's jump in and maybe just do a little bit of level setting to talk about what we mean when we talk about intersectionality. So I'll start off by reading maybe the textbook definition, and then I'm curious to see if that fits like what you think about when you think about intersectionality, and if there's anything you'd add. So I'll use Merriam-Webster. They say intersectionality is the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So that was a bit of a mouthful, and it was a little proper. So, but does that idea resonate with you? And is there anything you'd add to that or change about it?
Yeah. So, when I think about intersectionality, for me, I think all of those points are valid, especially I'm not going to get in a fight with Merriam-Webster, that's for sure.
Very fair.
But I think what it does convey is that, we're really good at drawing lines, especially recently. We say, I'm female, I'm Hispanic, I am this, I am that. And one thing that we forget is that a lot of the times we cross those lines, they're not really there. And so what you kind of take away from that is that there's a whole human experience between those lines. I'm not just a woman, I'm a Hispanic woman. And so as you start to add all those elements into it, you start to get more of a full human being. And unfortunately, to Merriam-Webster's point, you're not just going to suffer the discrimination or some of the stereotypes that you get from being just one part of a group, but you'll also suffer it from being in multiple different types of groups. So you kind of have it coming at you in a lot of different ways. But for me, why intersectionality is so important is because it addresses the whole individual as opposed to just, keeping one part. And within my National Latino Alliance, that's one thing that we're really cognizant of, especially as we put together events, is do we invite some of our other ARG groups that have those other pieces where we intersect, or bring people from our Latinos into the conversation, whether it be from a female's perspective, from a disabilities perspective, LGBTQIA perspective. Those are things that we like to think about, because again, it's about the whole human experience, not just about that one perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said about the lines crossing. And, I always think about it. I'm bisexual, and I feel like my experience is not just, being a woman plus being in the LGBTQ plus community. It's both of those together. It's bigger than the sum of its parts. So I love the way that you articulated that. Thank you. And for you, what does this look like in practice for you? Personally, or even at work, how do you feel like others' perceptions of you are maybe informed by this intersection of your identities?
Yeah. So I think it's a no-brainer as a woman, that I like to always reference this Taylor Swift song called "The Man," because I feel like it expresses the wholeness of the woman experience in the workplace, about some of the things that you encounter just as a woman in the workplace. I was just having a conversation with someone recently about how women, we almost seem to be on this slippery slope of if you are assertive and you are forward and you are direct, you're abrasive. If you are soft and you are quiet and observant, you're meek or shy or not confident. And so you really can't win. And one of the things that I was noticing one time is that we had two leaders, one male, one female, and both were acting the same exact way, very direct, forward, a lot of executive presence. And one was remarked, they were abrasive, and the other, which was the female, and then the male was remarked as being intimidating. And I thought, how interesting, that we have those two things that divide. But then when you throw on top, the Latina factor for me, I get a lot of, you're so passionate. And I am a very passionate person, don't get me wrong, but it's almost like this weird commentary of like, well, Latinos are passionate, right? You're passionate people. And my all-time favorite, spicy. I'm like, I like spicy food, but it's like, does that make me a spicy person? I don't know. So that's definitely something that I've encountered, throughout my career. And it's not just within the workplace, it's outside of it too. As you meet people, there are those perceptions and those stereotypes, unfortunately, that get pushed through, whether it's in the media, wherever. I love watching TikToks where they almost poke fun at that. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen America Ferrera give a wonderful talk about, her identity being her superpower, but she talks about how she would go into auditions, and unless she used a very heavy Hispanic accent, she wasn't Hispanic enough. And so I thought that's such an interesting concept, because it seems like that's what people expect from you. And especially when you walk around with a name like Noemi, and it goes in front of you, it goes into a room, before people can see my face, before people can hear my voice, I already know that I'm answering some questions the moment I open my mouth, which is, does she speak English? That's something I see the delight in the face, and it's like, oh yes, she speaks English, which is, but I'm saying it like that only because, that is a part of that intersection, right? It's not just a woman, but a woman from a different ethnicity who you're asking yourself a lot of questions because of those assumptions that are being made.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so much to deal with, like on a personal level, just running into those microaggressions day by day. And then even in the workplace, there's this layer on top of that too, right? Where those biases impact your career or could impact your career, depending on the people around you. So, in the workplace specifically, how do you address those stereotypes?
Yeah. So there's a direct way, I think, to do that, and I was listening in on your last discussion, and I thought that's really interesting on allies, and being able to ask some of those questions, especially if it's someone you trust and a leader that you have established connection with, to say, being called spicy or being called this or that doesn't really resonate with me. But that addresses like one individual. When I think of the whole, and you might laugh at this, but you have my tagline. Maybe she's born with it, maybe she worked really hard for it. This was something that was born out of me and another executive, female leader. And we're talking about just how when we get into meetings and you start to hear things like, we have a $5 million bogey, and you're like, what's a bogey? Like, I don't know what a bogey is. Well, it's a golf term. I'm like, what does that mean in golf? I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't know, par for the course. And I know nothing about sports, by the way, I just want to say, and nothing about sports. So that's really on me. But we were talking about just how, women have to go the extra mile to learn the lingo. And so me and her came up with this plan of like, let's introduce female terminology into it just for fun. Let's just see what happens. And one of the things that I started to do was I would be in meetings and I would just casually say something like, yeah, maybe it's Hurricane, Ian, or maybe it's Maybelline. And I'd see it in the room. Like, what did she say? But I started to introduce it just as something fun to change up a little bit of the way that we think about those terms and the way that we talk to each other. And she joined in and started saying things like, I think before we can add the polish, we need a little more filing and buffing. So
I love that.
Right? I loved it too. And I'm like, perfect. That's just a way to introduce, if we're getting to the same points, but in a very different way. And another way that I've done this in a sort of pushing back kind of way, but not really pushing back. But, one thing that women get a lot of times, right, besides being abrasive, is emotional. I've heard that before, like women are so emotional, and you can't get away from that. And so I'd say, well, what does emotional look like in the room? And I've seen, in meetings where men get very, very emotional. They get so heated in a conversation. And so I'll say something like, wow, there's a lot of emotions in here. Wow, we got really emotional. Just to kind of not in a weird way to attack, but in a way to address that these things are normal to each individual. These things are not something that is particular to a woman. It's not particular to an ethnicity. It's particular to a human reaction. And so we don't have to classify it as something that women do or that men do. It's something that we all have and that happens. And I'll say things like, oh, that meeting was spicy. Like people were getting spicy, and people will laugh, but I'm like, but once you start to classify some of those things as, hey, it's not just about a Latina being spicy in the room, but people get spicy. We all get our feathers ruffled, and we all have reactions to things, and we all want to defend our points and our opinions. And so is that what spiciness is? Then let's call it spicy. And that, Sarah, you can be spicy. I can be spicy. Anybody can be spicy. But it's a way to kind of, at least it's been my way of kind of pushing back a little bit on that and kind of turning it on its face and challenging that. Is that just true for me, or can that be true for anyone in the room?
Absolutely. I love that, kind of flipping those traditional words that can sometimes be really taken as microaggressions and really normalizing them across like everyone in the room. It's kind of like changing the culture and the common words that we use. It sounds like that's got to have an impact on the other people you work with who maybe share identities with you or might be impacted on those words or by those words. Is there anything else that you do consciously to kind of make way for people who are similar to you, who might be coming after you, or to really advocate for other people you share identities with in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. About a year ago, I became president of the National Latino Alliance Employee Resource Group here at Nationwide. And it wasn't something that just happened out of the blue for me. It was something that I always felt really passionate about throughout my career. So to give you some background, I grew up in LA between Compton and Watts. I would say I went from the hood to the boardroom. It's just my story. But I had a very different experience. And, growing up in a predominantly immigrant community, my community was mostly Spanish speaking, first generation immigrants. So you don't have any connection to the corporate world. You don't have a lot of people that you can look at and say, hey, they were in insurance, or they know what Fortune 100 companies are. You have no idea. My mom was a factory worker. My dad was a security guard, and that was the length of my experience. And so first one to graduate from college, I go to this corporate environment and I am completely lost. And I'm like, what do I do here? And fortunately, one thing I'll say about Nationwide is that they are incredibly invested in the individual. And like, if you are someone who is passionate and ambitious and really driven, they will pour into you with lots of mentorship, lots of development. And so I've been fortunate to have incredible leaders guide my career. And as I went through that process, I started realizing like there is so much that I just don't know. And if you don't know what you don't know, how can you change it? How can you be better? And so one thing that happened for me was, when I look at my community, I know that they don't know. I know that because we all sat in, the same kind of high schools trying to figure out how to fill out FAFSA forms. So our parents probably weren't reading in that language. We were usually we were probably writing their taxes and doing all of the paperwork. So you come from that experience and then you realize, okay, we have some roadblocks that maybe, nobody would even know unless you were within that community. You wouldn't know that that's a roadblock. So for me, it really lit a fire in me that's like, how do I get this to my people? How do I become your mentor, your leader, your friend, your resource, your cheerleader to help you remove those roadblocks? How do I give you the know-how? And I've been fortunate within the NLA to be able to do that. And anyone who sits with me gets like, if you schedule a one-on-one with me, you will get the full spill on like, you need to be doing this, connect with HRDP, you need to be putting your profile up, and you need to get your LinkedIn together, get a network. And it's not just about telling them what to do, but about making sure that they have all of the resources behind them. So a lot of the times, those conversations will turn into, can you walk my resume with me? And let's change some of those things. You know, can you, show me how you do X, Y, and Z? And so it can't be just, hey, you need to network. It's like, let me show you what that looks like. Let me connect you to people so that you can start to flex those muscles. So for me, it's not just the Noemi show. It's like, for me, I want to lift my community up with me, especially having the point of view of, I know where your struggle is, and let's help you, let's help you get past that and move up.
That's amazing. Telling people what they don't know that they don't know is so powerful, and making those connections for people to really help them get a leg up. And I wonder if, I don't know what that advice usually looks like, but there's, I think of there being kind of a difference of like, here's what you can do to change yourself to fit into this existing culture versus staying true to yourself, and being a part of that culture, keeping your own identity. Is that something that you think about, something that resonates with you? I guess thinking about like assimilating versus staying authentic to yourself.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's something that I actually was just this morning was having a conversation with someone on, and that was the evolution of, I've always been really proud of where I come from, proud of who I am, but how do you, get in the world of like, I want to carry with me my identity, but I don't want to be tokenized. I don't want people to think of chips and salsa when they see me. I don't want to have to lead with that, so it became a struggle, like how do I do that? And I got synced up with a mentor here in Columbus, Ohio, from the Latino Mentoring Academy. And believe it or not, our whole year mentorship was on how do I bring my identity forward into my career. And one of the things that the first thing we started on was my name. Like, we don't make excuses for your name. Like, we say Noemi. We teach people how to say your name. We don't go, Naomi's fine. It's like, no, first things first. It's like, who are you? And make sure that that's forward. And two, we don't have to reduce the things that you are to the stereotypes, right? It's not about chip salsa and Bad Bunny, and Selena. It's about, what have you learned? What valuable things do you bring with you from your community? And let those things take center stage. So within the Latino community, family is important, tenacity, hard work, very, very high work ethic, responsibility, and conscientiousness. And so letting those things be the driver on how you present yourself, especially when you're in when you have a seat at the table, right? That is so important, and it's staying within those decision seats. So I always tell, like, especially, I love that this is, women actuary allies, but this is so, so critical for you to stay in that decision seat. Don't shrink yourself to one identity, but use the opportunity that you have to have those decision seats, right? Where you get to sit with decision makers, give your opinions, help make those big decisions, and bring your point of view forward. That is where it's the most valuable, because that's all the gaps, that's all the blind spots. If everyone is the same, you're not going to be able to move forward. And so the diversity, that when we think about diversity, it's not enough to just have diverse people in the room and have them be silent. You need diversity in the room, and you need them to speak. You need them to say, here's how I see it because of where I come from and my point of view. And that is so, so incredibly valuable. And if you're an actuary, especially, you get some big seats, right away, because you have so much of that technical knowledge, you have so much of that insight. And so it's how do you use that information, Sarah versus I? How do you view the results versus I? And helping drive that. And I think when you bring that to the table and you speak up, it changes so many things that otherwise would stay the same. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love what you said about, being in that change, in the room where the impacts are made, where the decisions are made, and bringing your specific viewpoint is kind of bringing, where those lines cross for you, and letting that inform you. And, you mentioned actuaries have such a solid, training, and I guess I just also recognize that, sometimes people don't necessarily see that first. Some people might think, oh, it's just a diversity hire. She's, checking a box. And especially when you have multiple different identities intersecting, you check more than one metaphorical box is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So is that a perception that you've run into? And, how does that impact maybe feelings of imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So definitely, it definitely, it's a blow to your I don't want to say your ego, but your confidence, when you feel like that's why you were brought into the conversation. And a way that I've noticed that is expressed, because sometimes it's very overt, right? I've had that kind of comment made to me in the past by different people as I progressed in my career, like, oh, you're diversity hired, got it. That's why they got you. They needed a woman there, or they needed someone of color there. And you're just kind of like, what? And my leaders assured me every time, like, that is not why you're here. But it was like, is this, one thing I've learned, and I'll say this, and then I'll move into the next part of the question, is when you start to progress in your career, you're going to leave a lot of people behind, and you have to be okay with that. You have to feel comfortable with leaving some people behind that maybe you thought were friends, or maybe you thought were really good colleagues. You have to understand that it starts to become a lonely road somewhere, but it's okay. You're going to make other friends and other connections, and the people that are going to root you on and stick by you and support you and sponsor you and advocate for you, they will be around. They will always be around. They will never tear you down. So that's step one. Two, and I'm sorry, what was the second part of those questions?
Oh, sorry, just ask me about, feelings of imposter syndrome.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Definitely that can play in. So I before I get to the imposter syndrome, this is what I wanted to say, is one form of ways that I've seen it where it's less overt is the I don't even know how to title this, because I just want to say it's the underestimation of you. I've seen it where it's like, she looks really young. Can she? She seems kind of quiet. Can she? Well, is she capable of that? And I've seen that, not just for myself, but I've seen it come into question for other people. Like you said, you're very well trained. You went to a great school, and it might just be something that is on the surface that leads people to question your ability. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that. But I always say, if they underestimate you, feel no fear being the underdog. I feel like when you're the underdog, you compete so much more, and you kind of surprise everyone, and they're like, oh, I didn't know she could do that. But for me, it's a winning moment where it's like, I know that people who look like me, sound like me, are putting off these kinds of perceptions. But when we get to shine that out and prove them wrong, then I hope that the next person that looks like me, talks like me, sounds like me, that might carry some of those same perceptions would come after me and be met with confidence and be met with, I know someone like that who was phenomenal. So you have an opportunity to change those stereotypes and perceptions for the people behind you. So that is incredibly important. Now, as it comes to imposter syndrome, that is something that I've absolutely dealt with. And I will say one lesson I learned, I was reading a book by Sonia Sotomayor, who's our Supreme Court Justice, a phenomenal book. She is an amazing, amazing lady. And there were some words that she was giving about, having that imposter syndrome. And, she went to Princeton, she had all these accolades, and yet, again, she's like, here I am facing a situation where I feel like am I smart enough for this? One thing that she said that really stuck with me was, don't shrink yourself just because you feel small. And those moments come where you come into a room and you're like, man, these people went to really good schools. These people worked for the big consulting firms. Man, they have 15 years of experience. What do I know? You know, these are leaders. What do I know? What do I know? And so we have a tendency to let that overtake. And then I feel this small, so I'm going to make myself this small in the room. And whether it's in your posture, whether it's in you kind of wallflowering, right? Or like, I'm not going to approach, or even in, you know, not using your voice and staying completely mute through. I'm rewatching this telenovela that I grew up watching called Teresa, which I don't know who in this audience would know that. That's a very Hispanic thing. But the main lead is this villainess, and she is awesome. She's evil, but she's awesome, kind of like Regina George. And she has this mantra where she says, between being and not being, she says, I am. And she repeats this all the time. And for me, it's become like my own mantra. And I share this with everybody. If you are in a situation where that imposter syndrome kicks in and you have to choose between being and not being, be present, be loud, be confident, you know, pull those things out of you and believe in the value that you are bringing into that room more than you believe that you are unworthy of it. If I could go back in time, I would tell that to myself day one. Like, don't let the room terrify you to the point that you become as small as you feel. Be big, take room, use your voice.
I have chills. Between being and not being, I am. That's like amazing. I'm gonna have to watch this telenovela.
It's awesome. So it's a trip. It's a trip.
I love it. So to pick up on something you said about, you know, the other people really underestimating you, you know, when you're developing your career, you know, you really rely on people around you to give you feedback. And if the other people around you are underestimating you, or if they have certain perceptions of you based on just your identity, that has to impact the feedback that you get as well, even if they're not conscious of it. So is there anything that you kind of think about when you receive feedback, where, you know, it's like, how do you sift through it to see, you know, what's really valuable and what's maybe not as valuable because it is rooted in one of these biases?
Yeah. I would say have a really, really strong board of directors, right? A trusted group of people that know you well. That's why I think allyship is so important. Don't pick a group that only looks like you, sounds like you, that has the same identities as you. You want someone you want one or two or three people from that group, but you want a diverse number of people that can share their own perspective. Because sometimes it is blind spots. Sometimes it definitely is a blind spot that you're not seeing. Sometimes it's, believe it or not, between those intersectionalities, some of those things are embedded within that you are carrying with you. And so you bring those things with you, and then you don't even know that they're happening. And someone from somewhere else says, hey, do you know that and this is true for the Latino community, for instance, we're very much like, I'm going to go heads down, do my work, and someone will notice. And that's it. And someone from one of my allies had to tell me, it's not enough. You have to look up. You know, I know you do your hard work, but I don't know your name. I had that said to me about the NLA. Like, they said, hey, the NLA is amazing. You do so many things. Nobody knows who you are because your heads are down. And it was a shock to the system. Like, okay, I need to change that. And so that's where having diverse allies within your board of directors becomes valuable. But having them know you well and as people that you trust helps to sift through some of that. And, you know, I've had those moments where I've been given feedback and I've had to grapple with it. And it's never like something I grapple with for like a day. It's usually like a week. And I will ask, you know, my husband, is this true? Like, do I lack confidence? You know, do I come across this way? And he'll give me his insight. And then I'll ask someone who was, you know, over here, like, hey, is this true? Like, do you really experience me this way? Just to see what makes sense and what doesn't. And some of those things, it's a very, very quick, like, absolutely not, you know, it's just, having those people you trust. Like I had someone I asked, was like, no, is it true that I'm like, I lack executive presence? No, like who told you that? I'm like, well, here was the situation. Apparently, because I was really quiet in a room, it conveyed to someone that I needed to work on my executive presence. And, so some of that to me was like a yes and no, like other people don't experience me that way. Sometimes it's situational. So it's knowing where to place it. But one thing that I actually learned from one of my peers that he does this and models it really, really well is he and I have an agreement that after we do presentations or we're in meetings together where I'm leading the meeting or he's leading the meeting, we give each other direct feedback about how we think that went and how you did. And so, and we have to take it, whether it's good or bad, like we just have to like agree that we're going to be honest about that. That created so much trust between both of us because I believe that, he's there watching and he's going, hey, next time you could be more direct in XYZ, or next time you could bring this level of clarity. I can say next time you could be a little softer here. So if you have the ability to have a peer that you can trust to help you with that, it helps eliminate some of these other sideline things like, hey, did you see this in this meeting? Did I really say it that way, or did you take it that way? And we've had those conversations too, where it's like, yes, I did see that actually. And yes, it did come across that way. And they had the right to tell you that with feedback. But those are some of the ways that I try and sift through some of the things. And some of them are really obvious. So if someone calls me spicy, I'm like, okay, next. That's not valid. Unless I was eating a jalapeno. I don't know.
They probably don't mean jalapeno breath there.
Probably not.
Gosh, that concept of like a buddy for like open and honest feedback, that is so incredible. I'm definitely taking that. Amazing. And you talked a lot about a board of directors and allies. So I want to shift to, conversations about allies and, what we can do with this information. And just before I do, I want to just put a quick shout out. We're going to have 10 minutes for questions at the end. So think of your questions, put them in the chat. I would love to, get into them after we go through allyship. So, all right. So it sounds like you've had a great board of directors, a great set of people kind of steering you. Is there anything in particular, where you've had an experience with an ally where they've really made a strong difference for you? Like any particular like instances that really stick out in your mind is like, wow, they were a great ally there.
Yeah, I do actually. There's one ally I made very, very early in my career. She's actually my HR business partner. So, people think a lot of times that your HR business partners are there to handle the scary stuff, but in reality, they are an absolute great resource into helping you, craft your career. And me and her had early conversations just about where do you want to go and what do you want to do and what interests you. And over time, I can't tell you how many times she's come through with like job opportunities. And it wasn't always like, leave your role and go here and do that. But it was like, does this interest you? Is this the path that you want to be on? And that has been true all the way across up until my current role in this AVP role. I can't tell you how much she celebrated with me. She like jumped up and down and like gave me the biggest hug and was like, we knew we'd get here one day. But she helped me in making some really pivotal decisions where I really would be between one thing and another. And I go, well, I don't know what to choose. And she would weigh those things out with me very honestly, even if it was one of her roles that she's like, listen, I'm helping my leader and I really want you, but I'm going to give you the honest truth of where I think you should go based on where you want to go. And she's helped me with that. But I think if you're talking about an instance where it's so valuable to have allies and sponsors, people that are in rooms that you are not. You need those people. It's not enough to have your peers. You need people who are in those rooms without you. There was a situation in which I was not in the room and feedback was issued about me. And it was not relayed to me. And because she knew me really, really well, she stood up for me and said, hey, wait a minute, I know her. And I know that this is not the Noemi that I know. Let me set up time with her and give her this feedback so that we can start working on it. And I was surprised. I was like, what? I did not know that people were thinking this about me, but me and her came up with a plan on how do we mitigate this? How are we going to change this perception, because it can hurt my brand. And so it was so important. And that actually opened the door into having conversations with those leaders about, hey, I know that you believe, or that I'm giving off this perception. I want to address it directly. How do I change this? How do I help you see me as me? That created a domino effect of conversations where it impacted my career up until this point, where sometimes, I'm talking to one of those leaders and I'm like, remember when you thought this about me? And then we'd laugh about it. But I think about how valuable she's been. I'm like, I always tell myself, like, if she had not been in that room, would I have known what I know now? Would I have had the opportunity to change it, to address it, to fix it, to do better? I don't know. And so for me, allies are so incredibly important. That's one example. I have had so many, and I can't tell you how many doors have been opened by those allies. Anytime that I get asked, like, how did you get pulled into this project, or how did you get pulled into this program, or this development, conference, it's because of allies. It's because someone in the room said, hey, who'd be great for this person. So definitely get as many allies as you can. They're invaluable.
Absolutely. It sounds like you've had a lot of really amazing people in your life. That's incredible. And even within NAWA, there are so many people with so many different intersecting identities. We can all really be allies to each other. I guess I'm curious about your thoughts as to how allies can maybe refine their approach to take intersectionality into account, not just saying you're a woman, so, you could be more assertive in meetings or something, but also taking into consideration, like, well, if a Black woman is assertive in a meeting, she might be seen as like this angry Black woman stereotype, or like you've been saying, if a Latino woman is assertive in a meeting, she might be seen as spicy. So that one piece of advice doesn't necessarily apply across the board. So just interested in your thoughts there.
Yeah. So I think that allies, for me, right, like I'm an AVP, and I think about how do I serve my community and assist this uplift. So it is my job to bring others up, to make seat for them at the table. And I think it's the same for allies. They need to make seat for us at the table. That is their number one job, right? As allies, as mentors, as leaders, is to lift. And with that lift, and when I say allies and sponsors, right, it's people who speak on your behalf. And if you think about what that ally that I mentioned in that story I mentioned did for me, the piece of feedback was on my quietness and that meekness, that lack of assertiveness that seemed to kind of haunt me, because you can't tell from this camera, but I'm 5'2" and like 100 pounds. I'm a very small person. And so I'm very soft-spoken in the room. And I feel like that comes with the body. And at the time, I was younger in my career, so I wasn't always great at addressing that. And it was something I had been working through for so long that I feel like I finally figured it out, but I didn't know how to address it. And so as an ally, for me, it was both helping me navigate that part, but also standing up for me and saying, I know her. She's not meek. She's not quiet. She's not confident or assertive. I think it's something else, and let me work with her. And so I think about our allies in through those intersections. They first, if it's an ally and that ally really believes in you, it's your whole self, right, Sarah? It's not just, well, Sarah is bisexual, and therefore it's not that. It's Sarah is an intelligent, capable, strong leader. So notice, in none of those things are there any references to your gender, to your ethnicity, to your orientation, to any of those things. It's looking you for the value that you bring and putting that forward. And from then on, it's what is the value she brings? What is the perspective? What is the worldview that is going to help us think of things differently? To me, that's secondary, right? But who you are as an individual, as a whole, should be primary. And I think that that's how we have to start challenging some of these perceptions. We can't let those things kind of get away from us. And as an ally myself to others, those are things I question. When I hear those things about people, um, I've heard things like that before. I've heard them about a variety of things. Well, can they? And it's like, yes, they can. Is that a bias? Is that an unconscious bias? Is that fair? And I don't mind challenging that. And one leader one time told me, if you hear something, ask yourself, would they say the same thing to another class, to another gender, to another, group? If you know that they wouldn't, then that thing is a bias and you can't use that. And so for me, it's always a check. Like when I said, the two things, she was abrasive, he was intimidating. And I thought, interesting, because I saw the same thing from both. And so it's questioning that. Would I say that this is you said abrasive, would I say that this is something particular to this person? Or is it because I'm making an assumption based on an unconscious bias I'm bringing forward? So it's challenging that. And I have no qualms challenging people with that. Like, are we saying that because it's true to them, or because it's something that we think that is true to this group or to a group they belong to? I think that allies are in a powerful, powerful position to challenge those things. And it's an important job. And I think as leaders, it's vital for us to question those things, to challenge them, to change that groundwork. Otherwise, we're just going to see a lot more of the same.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This has been such an illuminating conversation. I've loved it. And, I've loved asking you questions, but I want to afford the opportunity to the rest of the chat as well. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we'll send those over. I don't think I've seen some throughout the conversation, although I've seen the chat talking about it, which is amazing. So feel free to send in those questions. I'll also just mention in the spirit of intersectionality and wanting to make sure that NAWA members are reaching out to other groups, that we're going to be putting some links to volunteer with our diversity partners, other diversity networks, Abacus Actuaries, the International Association of Black Actuaries, the Organization of Latino Actuaries, Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries, and the South Asian Network of Actuaries. So definitely encourage anyone still here to get involved with the different diversity network and bring intersectionality to the table. So I've said a lot, so I'll pause and see if we have any questions come in.
Sounds good. I will say, get involved. If you have the opportunity, I'd say this to everybody, get involved. It's so important and it's eye-opening. I feel like we always have room to learn, but if you want to make a difference, if you want to see the change, especially a lot of the things that I've been mentioning today, I think that's why these groups exist, and it's important for us to be a part of them, to volunteer, to participate. That's a lot of where this change can happen. So,
absolutely. All right, we've got a question from Celeste. As someone who also struggles with having a more quiet personality and my small stature, I'm curious about any ways you personally practice taking up space in a room. Did you have a personal mantra or mindset you practiced to become the more active voice you have now?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that I did, and I did this very recently, is lean into personality. That's okay. You don't need to change who you are. You don't have to be like a used car salesman, kind of shaking all the hands. But very recently, I actually had the opportunity to do a presentation on the NLA for our OCEO group and the president of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I say that only because that's not very intimidating, right? It is very intimidating. And I have no mic, and I'm like, okay, here we go. I have to suddenly speak very loudly to this room. And one of the things I mentioned was everybody else was doing their presentation sitting down with their laptops in front of them. But I knew that if I do that, and I hear it. So I stood up and I said, I'm going to stand because I know that with a small stature comes a small voice, and that voice doesn't carry. And it was a very self-deprecating way of pointing out, I know that this is true to me, and this is why. But also, if you can't hear me in the back, tell me, and I can get louder for you. It isn't something that I've been great at, but believe it or not, being in the camera has been helpful. Practicing at home, practice. Put some headphones in, and it will make your voice a lot louder. But don't be afraid. I say that when you have that in your head, like I'm soft spoken, the nerves kick in, and you kind of get paralyzed by it. Don't be afraid. Taking up space in a room doesn't always mean being the loudest person. It's the way that you carry yourself confidently. It's about your willingness to be vulnerable, to meet people, to say, this is who I am. Even if you can't hear me, like, you're going to know me, and you're going to know where I come from and what value that I bring. So to me, that's how you become louder and bigger in the room and take up that space. It's not, I'm going to yell, but it's like, I am going to come and meet you though and say, hi, nice to meet you. I'm Celeste, and here's my background, here's what I know, here's how long I've been with whatever company, and here's what interests me. And start having those kinds of conversations with people and let them get to know you. So don't be a wallflower. That'd be my number one advice. Don't stand in the corner and wait for someone to approach. I know that it's hard. I know it. Trust me. I learned this the hard way. It takes a little bit of guts, but just start trying to meet a couple of people and practice.
Thank you. Great advice. And the next two questions, I think, kind of relate to each other, so I'm going to combine them. So Kimberly says, I usually don't want to have an opinion until I know a lot about a subject, and therefore I'm quiet until I've learned enough. What tips do you have to keep from being invisible? And then Lisa says, I struggle with a message to get introverts to speak up more instead of encouraging supervisors to embrace the quiet contributions. So any thoughts on that? I see as kind of being two sides of the same coin, right? Like, how can I put my viewpoint forward without changing every aspect of myself and kind of changing the culture that we're in?
Yeah. I think that's very common, especially with introverted groups. I work with a lot of actuaries. They tend to be very introverted. And so I do give them the space to reach out, one-on-one, or if we're in a setting where, I let them have a group instead of, one-on-one, like asking a direct question, but say, hey, in a group, 2 or 3 of you, can you discuss this and give me your thoughts? That's one way I've addressed it in a group method. As far as being an observer, I am very much the same way. I like to learn about what I'm listening to. If I go to a meeting and I'm hearing a lot of things, I like to observe and digest and then offer my thoughts. What I will say to that though is just know that you are likely an expert in something. You are in that room for a reason. Sometimes you got to understand what you were brought in for. Sometimes if your leader brings you in and say, I need you to observe and listen and write notes so that you know what information to gather, great. You can ask questions then. But if you were brought in because you have a certain knowledge and expertise, they're expecting that to come out of you. Trust that. I've met a lot of people who say, well, I'm an expert at this thing that I do. And they get so tied into the job description. It's like, well, I analyze data and, I run numbers and that's what I do. That's not who you are though. And so if you tell me, well, what have you learned from that? And then it's like, well, is that I've learned that the markets are super volatile because they've been really impacted by inflation. And you start giving me this insight. It's like, that's the value you bring. That is your expertise. That is what I want to hear in the room. I don't want to hear your job description about how you use an Excel sheet. I want to hear your point of view because you are the expert. So trust that if you were brought in for that point of view. So even as you observe and collect and digest, once you get to a point where you're like, oh, this is my area, this is my expertise, don't be afraid and just offer your thoughts, because that's what they want you for. And I promise you, if we want to talk about how to change that perception that you're quiet or that you're invisible, I love people who are quiet observers and they come in with this punch that you're like, wait a minute, sorry, that was my time.
Talk about a punch.
No, it's crazy, right? It just punch everybody in the room. But I value those people because I realize, like, they're quiet observers, so man, when they talk, they've got something to say. And that for me doubles down on this is why I want him in that room with me. So yes, my dog's name is Demi.
It's so cute. Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. We're at time. I know Julia had a question in the chat as well about the importance of allyship before someone makes it into an industry. So maybe y'all could continue that conversation in the chat. I believe we have a 10-minute break coming up. And just before that, I'm putting a lot of links in the chat for volunteer opportunities. So I hope y'all take advantage. So thank you, Noemi, so much for having this conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for having me. This has been great.